April 18, 1945. Bavaria, Germany. 3:47 p.m. A rifle barrel pressed against the back of a German officer's skull. The man holding that rifle was 23 years old, 5'8", the son of Polish Jewish immigrants who arrived in America with $40 and a single suitcase. He had killed men in 3 countries. He had watched 41 of his friends drown in Italian mud at the Rapido River in a single night. He had a silver star he never talked about, and hands that had not shaken in 2 years of combat. And right now, in the cold dark of a Bavarian cellar, a German officer was looking him in the face and refusing to surrender. Not because the war wasn't over. Not because the German had a weapon. Not because he had any tactical choice left in the world. But because of what Corporal David Levine was. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of this community, because the stories we tell here are the ones history almost forgot. What happened in that cellar in the next 20 minutes would not appear in any official military report. It would not be mentioned in any newspaper. It would not be spoken about by the man who lived it for the remaining 56 years of his life. It survived in a single handwritten letter preserved by a woman in Augusta, Georgia, donated to a university archive by her daughter in 2003, and it tells us something about the war that the war itself was not willing to say out loud. This is the story of Corporal David Levine, Oberleutnant Heinrich Brandt, and Colonel James Whitfield. 3 men in a burned-out farmhouse at the end of the world. And the surrender that happened twice. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe had the smell of something already dead, but not yet buried. The numbers were catastrophic on a scale that the human mind was genuinely not built to process. The Soviet Union had lost somewhere between 26 and 27 million people. Germany had lost 5 million soldiers in combat alone, with another million civilians dead from Allied bombing. The United States had put 16 million men in uniform since 1941 and lost 400,000 of them. Every single day of fighting in the European theater in the final months of the war was killing people who were dying for a result that was already mathematically certain. Everyone knew it was over. The question was only when, and in that gap between knowing and ending, men were still dying every day. In Bavaria specifically, the American advance in April 1945 was moving at a pace that left the German military structure in a state of total internal collapse. The U.S. Third Army under Patton was driving southeast through the heart of southern Germany, and the speed of the advance was outrunning the German army's ability to organize any coherent response. Entire battalions were surrendering to individual American patrols. Generals were giving themselves up to sergeants. The entire command architecture of the Wehrmacht in Bavaria was dissolving like wet paper, and thousands of German officers were processing the end of everything they had believed in every single day, in fields and cellars and farmhouses across 100 miles of retreating front. Some surrendered with relief. Some surrendered with visible bitterness. Some surrendered with the blank mechanical compliance of men who had simply run out of war. The ideology that had organized 12 years of German public life did not disappear the moment a rifle appeared in a doorway. For some men it persisted. For some men it was the last thing left. Waldmünchen was a small village on the eastern edge of Bavaria, close to the border with Bohemia, the kind of place that existed mainly as a waypoint between larger places. The pine forests around it still held winter cold in mid-April, and the village had been shelled twice in the preceding week. The smell of burnt timber was in every street. 12 days from this particular afternoon, Adolf Hitler would be dead in a Berlin bunker. The war in Europe had perhaps 3 weeks left to breathe. Into this village on the afternoon of April 18th came a 3-man American patrol led by Corporal David Levine. David Levine was born in 1922 in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, the second child of Moshe and Rivka Levine, who had come through Ellis Island in 1921 with $40 a single leather suitcase and a combined vocabulary of approximately 30 words of English between them. Moshe Levine opened a dry goods store on Sutter Avenue within 2 years of arriving. He worked 7 days a week for 11 years to make it viable. And by the time David was old enough to understand what work meant, he had already understood it by watching his father do it. David worked the counter after school from the age of 12. He was quiet in the way that people become when they have grown up watching their parents rebuild from nothing, careful and precise, and completely without the casual confidence of people who have never had to calculate the cost of a mistake. He was good at mathematics. Genuinely remarkably good, the kind of good that his teachers noticed and mentioned, and that got him enrolled in night classes at Brooklyn College, which he attended 3 evenings a week, while continuing to work the counter at his father's store during the day. He enlisted in September 1942, 9 months after Pearl Harbor, 20 years old, 156 pounds, with eyesight of 20/15, and reflexes that the Army's intake assessors noted as exceptional. He was assigned to the infantry, which was where the Army put young men it needed to send toward bullets, and he went. He fought in North Africa. He crossed to Sicily. He ground his way up the Italian peninsula through the mud and the winter rain and the peculiar grinding misery of the Italian campaign, which was one of the most brutal and underreported theaters of the entire war. A campaign that cost the Allied forces 300,000 casualties to advance 500 miles up a peninsula the width of a large American state. At the Rapido River crossing in January 1944, his company lost 41 men in a single night. Levine survived. He carried a wounded man 300 yards through enemy fire to do it, which is what earned him the Silver Star, though he did not describe it that way and would not describe it at all for the remaining 57 years of his life. After Italy, after the German border, after 2 years of combat on 3 continents, David Levine was 23 years old, and he was done. Not broken, not traumatized in any way he would have recognized or named. Simply finished with the war in the way that men who have been in it long enough become finished with it past fear, past anger, reduced to the essential arithmetic of survival. He wanted to go home. He intended to go home. The war was almost over, and he was going to be alive when it ended. On the afternoon of April 18, 1945, Corporal David Levine led his 3-man patrol into the stone farmhouse on the eastern edge of Waldmünchen, because one of his men had heard voices from the cellar. He went down the stairs with his M1, Garand leveled, and his flashlight cutting through the dark, and he found 6 German officers sitting in the cold with their sidearms already placed on the floor in front of them, and he assessed the situation in approximately 3 seconds, and then gave the order in the serviceable German he had picked up across 2 years of moving through German-speaking territory. Get up, hands visible, single file to the stairs. 5 of the 6 men moved immediately. Their eyes were tired and their movements were careful and small, the movements of men who understood exactly where they were in history and had made their peace with it. The 6th man did not move. Oberleutnant Heinrich Brandt was 42 years old. He came from an old Munich military family with 4 generations of Wehrmacht service behind them. He was tall, correctly uniformed, even at this late hour of the war, with close-cropped gray temples and the rigid posture of a man who had spent decades being told that bearing was character. He had served in Poland in 1939. He had served in France in 1940. He had been in Russia for the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, before a leg wound rotated him back to a rear area security command in Bavaria, where he had spent the last year administering supply lines and prisoner transfers, and the administrative machinery of an army that was quietly coming apart around him. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life inside a hierarchy that told him certain categories of men existed below him in the natural order of things, and he had accepted that hierarchy not with cruelty exactly, but with the absolute ease of someone who has never once been asked to question it. It had simply been the air he breathed, the water he drank, the structure of the civilization he believed himself to be defending. He believed in rank. He believed in order. He believed in the architecture of a world that was at this precise moment approximately 12 days from total extinction. He sat with his back against the stone wall and looked at Levine for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I will not surrender to you. Brandt said. "Bring me an officer." Levine kept the rifle steady. "I am the ranking man in this room. You are my prisoner." Brandt looked at Levine's uniform at the Star of David, visible on the chain at his collar at his features. His expression did not change. It was not rage. It was not fear. It was something colder and more absolute than either of those things. It was a man reaching for the only structure he had left. "I know what you are," the Oberleutnant said. "I will not place myself in the custody of someone like you. Bring me an Aryan officer, or I will not move from this floor." The 4 other captured German officers in that cellar stared at their boots. Not one of them spoke. Levine did not raise his voice. He told the other 5 prisoners to move up the stairs under guard, and then stood alone with Brandt in the cold dark of the cellar, and told him one more time to get up. Brandt crossed his arms and waited. Levine stood still for a moment, looking at this man, who had fought across 3 countries in service of an idea that was now ash, who was sitting on the floor of a ruined farmhouse at the end of a lost war, and who was using the last available fragment of that idea as a weapon. Then Levine walked up the stairs, stepped out into the pale Bavarian sunlight, and sent a runner to find Colonel Whitfield. Colonel James Whitfield arrived at the farmhouse 20 minutes later. He was 37 years old, a career infantry officer from Augusta, Georgia. He was a hard, pragmatic man, with the lean economy of movement that comes from 3 years of combat command, and he had led his battalion from Tunisia to the German border without a single interview in any newspaper, and without any apparent interest in giving one. He was not a sentimental man. He was not a man given to speeches. He had grown up in the segregated South, and he carried the specific and complicated weight of that upbringing with him everywhere he went. And he had fought beside Black American soldiers in Italy and seen what they were capable of, and whatever he believed privately about race. In 1945, he had learned over 3 years of war that the only hierarchy that mattered in the field was the one earned in the dirt. When Levine reported what had happened in the cellar, keeping his voice flat and his face absolutely still, Whitfield listened without expression. Then he walked down the cellar stairs himself. Brandt looked up with obvious relief when he saw the colonel's oak leaf clusters in the flashlight beam. He began to speak immediately. He had no objection to American authority. He was prepared to surrender fully and formally. He simply required the dignity of surrendering to a proper officer, a man of equivalent standing, the kind of formal military courtesy that the rules of war were designed to provide. Whitfield let him finish. Every word. Then Whitfield turned around, walked back up the stairs, and called Levine down into the cellar. He told the corporal to stand directly in front of the prisoner. Then he turned to Brandt, and when he spoke, his voice carried no heat at all, which made it considerably more frightening than shouting would have been. "This soldier found you," Whitfield said. "This soldier ordered you to surrender, and you refused. This soldier has fought in 3 countries and has bled for this army while you were sitting in a basement. You will surrender to Corporal Levine. You will hand him your officer's identification. You will state clearly that you are surrendering yourself and your rank to his custody. And if you do not, I will note in my official report that you actively resisted capture, which carries consequences I imagine you would prefer to avoid at this particular moment in the war." Brandt opened his mouth once, then closed it. He stood up slowly from the stone floor, reached into his breast pocket, and held out his identification booklet with both hands. Levine took it. "I surrender to your custody," Brandt said. Levine accepted the document, marked the time in his field notebook, and walked Brandt up the stairs into the pale Bavarian sunlight. He did not say a word of triumph. He did not look back. Whitfield never mentioned the cellar in his official after-action report. He filed 6 German officers no resistance. He did write about it once in a private letter to his wife in Augusta that she preserved for 58 years before their daughter donated it to a university archive. He wrote that he had done it not because it was regulation and not because he was a righteous man, but because he was tired. Tired of watching the world hand dignity to people who had not earned it and withhold it from people who had. He wrote that Levine had not needed anyone to fight his battle for him. What the corporal needed was for the record to be correct. David Levine came home to Brooklyn in August 1945. He finished his mathematics degree at Brooklyn College. He earned a teaching certificate. He spent 31 years teaching high school mathematics at Jefferson High School in East New York, known to his students for his precision, his patience, and his complete refusal to pass anyone who had not genuinely earned it. He retired in 1979. He never spoke publicly about the war. He died in 2001. His daughter cleaning out his apartment found a silver star in a shoebox on the top shelf of his closet, still in the original leather case, never displayed. And beside it, in a manila envelope, a single page in his handwriting, the only account he ever wrote of what had happened in that cellar in Bavaria in April 1945, ending with a sentence that read, "He walked out into the light, and I did not need to say anything at all." But here is what the history books do not tell you about that afternoon. What happened in that cellar was not the end of the story. Because 3 months later, Heinrich Brandt sat in front of an Allied denazification tribunal, and the question of what he had done in that cellar, what Levine had done, what Whitfield had done, came up again. And what Brandt said under oath would force every man in that room to confront something about the war that the official record had been quietly, carefully, deliberately avoiding. In Part 2, we go inside the denazification process, inside the testimony that almost never happened, and inside the question that Brandt had been sitting with since the moment he walked up those cellar stairs. What do you do when the system that told you who to be turns out to have been wrong about everything? In a cellar in Bavaria, on April 18, 1945, Corporal David Levine stood alone with a German officer who refused to surrender to him because of what he was. 20 minutes later, that same officer placed his identification booklet into Levine's hands and spoke the words out loud. Colonel James Whitfield had walked down those stairs, listened to a man use the wreckage of a dying ideology as his last weapon, and decided that the record was going to be correct. 6 prisoners. No resistance. That was the official report. But the real story was not finished, because 3 months later, Heinrich Brandt sat in front of an Allied tribunal. And the question of what happened in that cellar came up again. Here is the number that matters before we go further. In the autumn of 1945, the Allied denazification program processed approximately 3.5 million German cases. Of those, fewer than 1% resulted in classification as a major offender. The overwhelming majority of men who had participated in 12 years of Nazi governance, who had administered its armies and its bureaucracies and its ideology, walked out of those tribunals classified as followers or exonerated entirely, assessed a fine, barred from office for a few years, and returned to civilian life. The machinery of accountability was enormous in scale and astonishingly limited in reach. Heinrich Brandt understood this perfectly. He had watched the process from inside the prisoner of war facility near Regensburg, all summer talking to other officers, reading what documentation filtered through, calculating. He was a careful man, a systematic man. He had spent 42 years inside bureaucratic structures, and he knew how they worked. He knew that the tribunal was looking for specific categories of evidence, specific language, specific acts. He knew what to say and what not to say. He had a plan. And his plan was working perfectly until the morning of October 14, 1945, when an American officer walked into the tribunal room carrying a field notebook. The notebook belonged to Corporal David Levine. Captain Richard Morrow was 31 years old, a JAG officer from Cleveland, Ohio, who had been assigned to the Regensburg Tribunal 3 weeks earlier, and who had developed the specific habit, unusual among his colleagues, of actually reading the field documentation attached to prisoner capture records. Most of his colleagues processed the paperwork at face value. Morrow read it. And in Brandt's file behind the routine capture report, he had found a discrepancy. The official record said 6 German officers, no resistance. But the timeline didn't match. The patrol had entered the farmhouse at 15:47. Brandt's processing at the collection point was logged at 17:22. An hour and 35 minutes for a 6-man surrender with no resistance. Morrow had pulled Levine's field notebook from the records division. He had read the entry for April 18, 1945. And then he had driven 3 hours to Brooklyn to talk to a mathematics teacher who had not spoken about the war to anyone. "I'm not looking to make trouble," Morrow told Levine, sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment on Sutter Avenue. "I'm looking to make the record accurate." Levine was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the window. Then he looked at Morrow. "He was a frightened man doing what frightened men do," Levine said. "He used the only thing he had left." "That's not what I asked." Another silence. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to tell me exactly what happened in that cellar. Everything. In the order it happened," Levine told him. "All of it. Whitfield's arrival. The second trip down the stairs. The words Whitfield had used. The identification booklet held out with both hands. He told it the way he had processed everything in his life precisely and without editorializing, as if he were reading from a ledger. When he finished, Morrow wrote for another minute without speaking. Then he closed his notebook and said, "Colonel Whitfield filed no resistance." "I know what he filed. Were you angry about that?" Levine looked at him with an expression that Morrow would describe later as the most unreadable thing he had ever seen on a human face. "He made the record correct in the way that mattered," Levine said. "That was enough." Morrow flew back to Regensburg. He requested a supplemental hearing for Brandt's case. His supervising officer, Lieutenant Colonel George Harwick, denied the request the same afternoon. Harwick was 54 years old, a military lawyer who had been processing denazification cases since August, and who had developed a working philosophy about the entire enterprise that could be summarized as follows: completion was more important than precision. The tribunal had 3.5 million cases. It had limited time. It had limited staff. The categories were defined. The evidence requirements were established. What Morrow was proposing, opening a supplemental hearing based on a field notebook discrepancy and the testimony of a corporal about a cellar confrontation that had lasted less than an hour, was in Harwick's assessment an extraordinary expenditure of resources for a case that was already classified, already resolved, and already in the outbox. "The man refused to surrender to a Jewish soldier," Morrow said. "He cited the soldier's ethnicity as his explicit grounds for refusal. That is documented." "It is documented in a field notebook that was never incorporated into the official capture record," Harwick said. "The official record says no resistance." "Because the officer who filed that record made a judgment call. Which judgment calls are exactly what field officers are authorized to make. Morrow, I have 412 open cases on my desk. Brandt's category is already determined. He's a follower. He gets a fine and a 4-year bar. That is what the process produces for his file. His file is incomplete." Harwick took his reading glasses off and set them on the desk with a careful precision that communicated more clearly than volume could have. "Every file in this room is incomplete. Every single one. That is the nature of what we are doing here. We are not writing history. We are processing an administrative transition. If you want to write history, find a university." Morrow left the office. He did not drop the case. What he did instead was find Captain Eleanor Strauss. Strauss was a 34-year-old American officer attached to the tribunal as a document analyst, one of approximately 200 Jewish American military personnel who had been assigned to various phases of the denazification process across occupied Germany, a fact that carried a specific and unspoken weight in every room they walked into. She had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the daughter of a rabbi, and she had a law degree from Ohio State and a mind that processed systemic arguments the way a lathe processes metal with absolute clean precision. She had been trying for 6 weeks to get Harwick to adopt a supplemental evidence protocol for cases where field documentation contradicted official reports. Harwick had declined 3 times. When Morrow showed her Levine's notebook entry, she read it twice. Then she looked up. "Whitfield is still in Germany," she said. "I know." If Whitfield gives a supplemental statement, Harwick can't exclude it on procedural grounds. An officer's testimony about his own after-action report is primary documentation. Whitfield filed no resistance. Whitfield can file a clarification. Morrow was quiet for a moment. "You think he will?" Strauss looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has spent 6 weeks watching men calculate the cost of accountability. "I think," she said carefully, "that the right question is whether what happened in that cellar should be in Brandt's record, not whether it's convenient, not whether it changes his classification, whether it should be there. And if it doesn't change his classification, then it doesn't change his classification, but it's still the truth." Morrow drove to Whitfield's current posting outside Munich. He found the colonel in a field office reviewing unit deployment paperwork, and he explained what he was asking and why. Whitfield listened without interruption. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. "You're asking me to amend an after-action report I filed 6 months ago. I'm asking you to provide a supplemental statement about an event that was not fully documented in the original report." "Same thing." "Yes." Whitfield looked at him. "What does Levine say?" "He says what happened in that cellar was enough. He's not asking for this." "But you are. The record should be accurate, Colonel." Whitfield was quiet again. Then he said, "You know what Harwick's going to do with this. He's going to note it, put it in the file, and Brandt still walks out classified as a follower with a fine he can afford to pay." "Probably. So what does the supplemental statement actually accomplish?" Morrow thought for a moment. "It makes the record correct," he said, "in the way that matters." Whitfield looked at him for a long time. Then he pulled a sheet of paper from the desk drawer and uncapped his pen. The supplemental statement was 3 paragraphs. It described exactly what had happened in the cellar. It described Brandt's refusal, his stated grounds, the second surrender Whitfield had required. It was signed, dated, and submitted to the tribunal the following morning. Harwick read it. He noted it. He attached it to Brandt's file. He did not change the classification. Brandt was assessed his fine and his 4-year bar and returned to Munich to work as a municipal records clerk, which he did until 1968. But the statement was in the file, and the file went into the archive. And in 1981, when a West German documentary filmmaker researching the final weeks of the war in Bavaria requested access to tribunal records for the Regensburg region, Brandt's file was among those released. The filmmaker read Whitfield's supplemental statement. He found Brandt now 78 years old and living in retirement in Munich, and he asked him about it. Brandt was quiet for a long time after the question. Then he said that he had been wrong about certain things, and that the wrong had been his, and that he had understood it on the stairs of that cellar, when the American corporal had walked him out into the light without a word of triumph. The film was broadcast in West Germany in October 1981, 43 years after the events it described. David Levine was 59 years old and teaching his third-period mathematics class at Jefferson High School in East New York when it aired, and he never saw it and probably never knew it existed. But here is what the film did not include. What the filmmaker found in that archive but could not fit into his documentary. What Captain Eleanor Strauss had quietly documented during her 6 weeks at the Regensburg Tribunal in a report she submitted to her superiors in November 1945, and that sat in a military archive in Washington for 58 years, before a historian named Patricia Kohler requested it under a Freedom of Information filing in 2003. Strauss had cross-referenced the Brandt supplemental with 47 other cases in the Regensburg Tribunal files that showed similar discrepancies. Field documentation that contradicted official capture reports, evidence of incidents involving Jewish American soldiers that had been quietly removed from the official record by the officers who filed them. 47 cases, same pattern, same mechanism. The same instinct toward administrative smoothness that had led Whitfield to write No Resistance in the first place before Morrow found the notebook, and Strauss found the pattern, and a colonel in a field office outside Munich uncapped his pen. The Kohler report, published in the Journal of Military History in 2004, argued that the true number of such cases across the entire denazification process was likely in the hundreds. That the machinery of accountability that had been built to correct the record of 12 years of ideology had itself quietly replicated one of that ideology's core habits. The habit of treating certain people's experiences as less documentable, less official, less worth the administrative inconvenience of accuracy. Whitfield's 3-paragraph statement had not changed Brandt's classification. It had not changed the outcome of the war. It had not saved anyone or destroyed anything. But it had put a truth into a file that would otherwise have been empty of it, and that file had gone into an archive, and the archive had been opened, and the truth had come out. In Part 3, we follow what happened when Kohler's report landed in 2004, and the families of the men in those 47 cases started looking for the records that should have existed, and what they found when they looked. In April 1945, a German officer in a Bavarian cellar refused to surrender to a Jewish soldier. Colonel James Whitfield walked down those stairs and made him do it twice. The official report said no resistance, but Captain Morrow found a field notebook. Captain Strauss found a pattern, and Whitfield uncapped his pen and wrote 3 paragraphs that put the truth into a file that would have otherwise been empty of it. The case was closed. Brandt paid his fine. Levine went home to Brooklyn, and for nearly 60 years the file sat in an archive in Washington untouched. Then in 2004, historian Patricia Kohler published her report. 47 cases with the same pattern. Hundreds more likely across the full denazification record. And the families of the men in those cases started looking. Here is the number. By 2006, requests for supplemental denazification records related to Jewish American military personnel had increased by over 300% at the National Archives. 300% in 2 years. Most of those requests came from people who had never heard of Patricia Kohler. They came from people who had found a footnote, or a letter, or a photograph in a shoebox, and had started pulling the thread. And what they found when they looked was not what they expected. The Kohler report had identified a specific bureaucratic mechanism. When field documentation conflicted with official reports in cases involving Jewish American soldiers, the official report consistently took precedence, and the field documentation was filed separately in supplemental folders that were not cross-referenced in the main index. This was not a conspiracy. It was not organized. It was the aggregate result of thousands of individual decisions made by individual officers, each one making the same calculation. Whitfield had made each one choosing administrative smoothness over documentary precision, and each one producing the same erasure. The pattern had a name inside the denazification apparatus. Harwick had called it completion over precision. Strauss had called it something else in her 1945 report, a report that had sat unread in the Washington Archive for 58 years. She had called it the second disappearance. The first disappearance was what the Nazis had done. The second was quieter. It was what the documentation did afterward, the slow administrative process by which certain experiences became less official, less indexed, less findable, until they existed only in shoeboxes and private letters and field notebooks that nobody had thought to cross-reference. The Brandt file was the cleanest example in Kohler's dataset because it had Whitfield's supplemental statement. Most of the 47 cases had no such statement. They had only the discrepancy, the gap between the field timeline and the official report, the hour and 35 minutes, that didn't add up with nothing inside it. In 2005, a woman named Susan Adler, 61 years old, a retired schoolteacher from New Jersey, submitted a records request to the National Archives for the denazification file of a German officer named Willy Fuchs, who had been captured in April 1945 by her father's unit near Nuremberg. Her father, Sergeant Aaron Adler, had been one of the 47 cases in Kohler's report. His field notebook, preserved by a records clerk who had not followed the standard filing protocol, described an incident in a roadside ditch outside Nuremberg on April 22, 1945, in which Fuchs had refused to surrender to Adler and had struck him across the face before complying. The official capture report said no resistance. Adler had never told his daughter what had happened. He had died in 1998. Susan Adler had found his field notebook in the same shoebox where Levine had kept his silver star, and she had read the entry for April 22nd, and she had submitted the records request not because she expected anything to change, but because she wanted the file to be accurate. She wanted the record to be correct. The archivist who processed her request was a 34-year-old named Marcus Webb, who had read Kohler's report the previous year, and who had developed the habit unusual among his colleagues of actually cross-referencing supplemental folders against main index entries. He found Fuchs's file in 40 minutes. He found the discrepancy in 10 more. He contacted the German Federal Archive in Koblenz, which maintained the denazification tribunal records for the Nuremberg region. The German archivist on the other end of that phone call was named Gerhard Sommer. He was 57 years old and had been working with denazification records for 22 years. When Webb explained what he was looking for, Sommer was quiet for a moment. Then he said in careful English, "We have been waiting for someone to ask about this file for a long time." Fuchs's tribunal record had a supplemental folder. Inside that folder was a statement from a German lieutenant who had witnessed the incident in the ditch. The lieutenant, whose name was Karl Reimer, had written his statement in November 1945 and submitted it to the tribunal unsolicited, apparently on his own initiative, apparently because he had been unable to stop thinking about what he had seen. The statement described the incident precisely. It described Fuchs striking Adler. It described Adler not responding. It described the silence in the ditch afterward, and Adler standing up and walking Fuchs to the collection point without a word. Reimer's statement had been filed in the supplemental folder and not cross-referenced. It had never been read in any official proceeding. Fuchs had been classified as a follower, assessed a fine, and returned to civilian life in 1946. He had died in 1979. But the statement was there. Susan Adler received a copy of Reimer's statement in March 2006. She read it twice. Then she called her brother in California and read it to him over the phone. Her brother Daniel Adler was 64 years old and had spent 40 years not asking his father about the war. He had known in the way that children of veterans know things without being told them that something had happened in Germany in 1945 that his father had decided to carry alone. He had watched his father teach mathematics and coach Little League and argue about baseball statistics at the dinner table, and he had never asked because his father had never offered, and that had been the agreement between them for 40 years. He listened to his sister read the statement. He did not say anything for a long time afterward. Then he said, "He walked Fuchs to the collection point without a word." "Yes," Susan said. "That sounds exactly like Dad." The Adler case became the most documented example in what Webb and Sommer were by then calling the supplemental project, an informal collaboration between the National Archives and the German Federal Archive to cross-reference the 47 Kohler cases and identify any existing documentation in supplemental folders on either side of the Atlantic. By the end of 2006, they had found corroborating documentation in 19 of the 47 cases. 19 files that had been waiting in supplemental folders on 2 continents for someone to cross-reference them. None of the corroborating documentation changed any classification. None of it altered any legal outcome. Every man it described had already lived his life, paid his fine, or served his time, or returned to civilian anonymity, and most of them were dead. The documentation did not accomplish anything in the conventional sense of the word accomplish. It did not correct an injustice or provide restitution, or bring anyone to account for anything. What it did was put things into files that should have been there from the beginning. In 2007, the project published its findings in a joint report issued simultaneously by the National Archives and the German Federal Archive. The report documented the supplemental folder pattern across the full denazification record, not just the 47 Kohler cases, but a systematic analysis of approximately 12,000 files from the Regensburg, Nuremberg, and Munich tribunals. The pattern held across all 3 regions. The aggregate erasure was not random. It was consistent. It was the product of a process that had, at every level, and in every tribunal, and in every filing room, made the same small choices in favor of administrative smoothness, and those choices had accumulated into something that looked from the distance of 60 years less like negligence and more like a decision. The Brandt file was included in the report's introduction as the clearest example of the pattern and its correction, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it had the most complete paper trail. It had Levine's field notebook. It had Morrow's request. It had Strauss's 1945 report. It had Whitfield's supplemental statement. and it had the gap between 1547 and 1722 that hour, and 35 minutes of undocumented time in a cellar in Bavaria, which was now documented in 4 separate sources across 2 national archives. David Levine had been dead for 6 years when the report was published. Whitfield had died in 1994. Morrow had died in 2001. Strauss was 86 years old, living in a retirement community in Boca Raton, Florida. And when a researcher from the Joint Project called to tell her that her 1945 report had been included, she said that she was glad someone had finally read it. And then she asked whether the researcher wanted the original copy because she had kept it in a filing cabinet in her bedroom for 62 years, and she had been wondering what to do with it. The researcher drove to Boca Raton 3 days later. Strauss handed over the original report typed on Army-issue paper in November 1945. 62 years old, the carbon copy still legible. Then she showed the researcher something else. At the bottom of the last page of the report in handwriting, she identified as her own was a single line she had added after typing the official text. A line she had not included in the version she submitted to her superiors. A line she had written for herself. It said, "The record should be correct, not because it changes anything, because it is the record." The joint report was reviewed in 12 academic journals and 2 major newspapers. It was cited in a subsequent German parliamentary inquiry into denazification completeness that ran from 2008 to 2011. It generated correspondence from approximately 300 families across the United States, Germany, Austria, and Israel, families who had found their own shoeboxes and their own field notebooks and their own gaps in the official record, and who were writing to ask whether anyone had cross-referenced their file. The answer in most cases was no. But Webb and Summer were still working. There is a question that sits underneath all of this, and that the academic literature has generally declined to answer directly. Not the historical question of why the erasure happened, because the historical explanation is clear and documented and unambiguous. But the moral question. The question of what it means that Whitfield filed no resistance and then wrote 3 paragraphs, and that those 2 things are both true about the same man on the same day. Brandt gave his 1981 interview and said he had been wrong about certain things, and that the wrong had been his, and that he had known it on the stairs of that cellar. What he meant by that, what specific understanding arrived in him as he walked up those stairs behind David Levine into the pale Bavarian sunlight, is not something the record can tell us. The record can only tell us what he said about it 36 years later to a documentary filmmaker in Munich. Levine's daughter found his field notebook in the shoebox with the silver star. She donated both to the Brooklyn Historical Society in 2003, the same year she donated the silver star. The field notebook is now digitized and available in the Society's online archive. The entry for April 18, 1945, is 8 lines long. It records 6 prisoners, the time of capture, the location, and 1 additional detail that Levine added after the standard information, a single sentence that does not appear in any other entry in the notebook. It reads, "He walked out. He did not look back." And in Part 4, the final chapter, we ask the question that the record itself cannot answer. What does it mean to be the person who keeps the record correct when no one is watching? When nothing changes, when the war is already over and the world has already moved on? What does it mean that Levine never spoke about it? That Whitfield almost didn't write the statement? That Strauss kept her report in a filing cabinet for 62 years? And what does it tell us about the difference between a history that is documented and a history that is true? 4 parts. 4 conversations about the same hour and 35 minutes in a Bavarian cellar on April 18, 1945. A corporal who found 6 German officers in the dark. A colonel who walked down the stairs and back up and then down again. A 3-paragraph supplemental statement that sat in a file for 60 years. A pattern of 47 cases that became a joint archival project across 2 continents. And underneath all of it, the same question asked in different ways by Morrow and Strauss and Kohler and Webb, and a retired school teacher in New Jersey reading a field notebook she found in her dead father's shoebox. The question is not what happened. The record now tells us what happened. The question is what it means that keeping the record correct required every single time an individual person making a deliberate choice to do it. Not a system, not a protocol, a person. And there is one more thing the record tells us about David Levine that almost nobody knows. David Levine came home to Brooklyn in August 1945. He was 23 years old. He had been in uniform for 3 years, had fought in 3 countries, had watched 41 men die in a single night at the Rapido River, and had carried a silver star in his field kit for 18 months without mentioning it to anyone. He came home on a Tuesday. He was back working the counter at his father's dry goods store on Sutter Avenue by Thursday. His mother made brisket. His father shook his hand once and then went back to inventory. That was the homecoming. That was all of it. He enrolled at Brooklyn College in September. He finished his mathematics degree in 1947. He earned his teaching certificate in 1948. He was hired by Jefferson High School in East New York in the autumn of 1949, assigned to teach algebra and geometry to 9th and 10th graders. And he walked into that classroom on the first day of school and wrote his name on the board, and told his students that mathematics was the only subject in the world that did not require you to take anyone's word for anything, because every answer was either provable or it wasn't, and if you couldn't prove it, you didn't know it yet. He taught that class for 31 years. He was not a warm teacher in the conventional sense. He was not the teacher who put his arm around struggling students and told them they could do it. He was the teacher who sat down next to a struggling student, opened the textbook to the problem, and worked through it from the beginning without commentary, without reassurance, without anything except the precise sequential logic of the solution itself. His students either loved him or were terrified of him, or both simultaneously. His pass rates were among the highest in the school for 25 consecutive years. He never gave a student a grade they had not earned. He retired in 1979 at the age of 57. He lived alone in the same apartment on Sutter Avenue where he had grown up, his parents having died in 1961 and 1967 respectively. He read mathematics. He followed the Mets with the specific, anguished loyalty of a man who has chosen his suffering deliberately. He had lunch every Tuesday with a former colleague named Bernard Katz, who had taught English at Jefferson for 20 years, and who said later that in 20 years of Tuesday lunches, Levine had never once mentioned the war. He died in 2001 at the age of 79. His daughter, cleaning out the apartment, found the silver star in the shoebox. She found the field notebook in a manila envelope beside it. She found at the bottom of the same shoebox something that neither she nor anyone who has subsequently written about David Levine had expected to find. She found Heinrich Brandt's officer identification booklet, the one Brandt had held out with both hands in the cellar, the one Levine had taken, the one he had noted in his field notebook and then apparently kept for 56 years, in a shoebox on the top shelf of his closet next to his silver star and his field notebook and the record of everything that had happened in that cellar. There is no explanation in the record for why he kept it. His daughter does not know. Bernard Katz does not know. The Brooklyn Historical Society, which now holds all 3 items, has no documentation explaining the decision. Levine left no note. He wrote nothing about it in the field notebook, which ends 3 weeks after the cellar incident with a routine entry about a supply requisition dated May 7, 1945. What we know is that he kept it. For 56 years, the identification booklet of the man who had refused to surrender to him sat in a shoebox in his apartment, alongside the medal he never displayed and the notebook that documented the event that produced both of them. He carried all 3 things home from the war, and he kept all 3 things for the rest of his life, and he never said a word about any of them to anyone. The question of what that means is not one the record can answer. Heinrich Brandt died in Munich in 1989, the same year the Berlin Wall came down. He had given one interview in 1981 in which he said he had been wrong about certain things, and that the wrong had been his, and that he had known it on the stairs of that cellar. He said nothing about the identification booklet. He may not have known Levine kept it. He may not have thought about it. He had spent 40 years as a municipal records clerk processing the administrative paperwork of a city rebuilding itself from rubble, and whatever he had understood on those cellar stairs had apparently not produced in him any impulse to find Levine, or contact him, or acknowledge what had happened in any way beyond that single interview. That is its own kind of answer. Not a satisfying one, but an honest one. James Whitfield died in Augusta, Georgia in 1994 at the age of 86. He had retired from the Army in 1962 as a brigadier general, having commanded units in Korea and served in various staff positions throughout the 1950s. He never spoke publicly about the cellar. The letter he wrote to his wife, the one she preserved, and their daughter donated to the university archive in 2003, is the only account of the event in his own words. His daughter, when contacted by a researcher from the Joint Archival Project in 2006, said that her father had been a complicated man, about whom she had complicated feelings, and that she had donated the letter because she believed it showed him at his best, and that she thought he deserved to be remembered at his best, even by people who might reasonably find other parts of his record harder to account for. That is a precise and honest thing to say about a person, and it applies to most of the people in this story. Eleanor Strauss lived to be 91. She died in Boca Raton in 2006, 3 months after handing her 1945 report to the researcher from the Joint Project. She had been a practicing attorney in Cincinnati from 1948 to 1981, specializing in employment discrimination law, and had argued 3 cases before the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, winning 2 of them. She had kept the original copy of her 1945 report in a filing cabinet in her bedroom for 62 years. When the researcher asked her why, she said she had kept it because she had not known what else to do with it, and because throwing it away had seemed wrong, and because she had believed without any particular evidence for most of those 62 years that someone would eventually ask for it. Richard Morrow died in Cleveland in 2001, the same year as Levine, at the age of 87. He had returned to civilian law after the war and had practiced in Cleveland for 40 years. His son, contacted by the Joint Project in 2006, said his father had occasionally mentioned the Brandt case when discussing his military service and had described it as the most important thing he had done in the Army, which his son had found puzzling because nothing visible had resulted from it. His father had explained that the point was not the result. The point was that Whitfield had written the statement, and it was in the file, and the file was in the archive, and the archive was accessible. The point was that the truth was findable by anyone who looked. Morrow had said this to his son sometime in the 1970s, 30 years before Kohler looked, and Webb cross-referenced, and Summer opened the Koblenz files. He had said it without knowing whether anyone ever would look. He had said it as a statement about what the act of documentation means, independent of whether the documentation is ever used. The Joint Archival Report, published in 2007, documented the supplemental folder pattern across approximately 12,000 denazification files. It found corroborating documentation in 19 of the 47 Kohler cases. It was cited in a German parliamentary inquiry that ran for 3 years and produced recommendations for systematic cross-referencing of supplemental folders that were implemented in 2013. The German Federal Archive now maintains a searchable cross-index of supplemental documentation for all denazification tribunal records accessible online in German and English. The Brandt file is entry number 1 in that index, not because it is the most important case, because it is the most complete. It has Levine's field notebook. It has Whitfield's supplemental statement. It has Morrow's request and Strauss's 1945 report, and the gap between 1547 and 1722 that started all of it. It is the most documented hour and 35 minutes in the entire supplemental folder archive, and every piece of that documentation exists because individual people, none of whom coordinated with each other, none of whom knew what the others were preserving, made individual decisions to keep things that could have been discarded. Whitfield almost didn't write the statement. Strauss kept her report in a filing cabinet for 62 years without knowing if it would ever matter. Morrow drove to Brooklyn to talk to a mathematics teacher who had spent 30 years not talking about the war. Webb cross-referenced a supplemental folder on a hunch. Summer said he had been waiting for someone to ask. And Levine kept a German officer's identification booklet in a shoebox for 56 years and never told anyone. What the record cannot tell us is what he thought when he looked at it. Whether he looked at it. Whether it was in the shoebox because he intended to keep it there, or because putting it somewhere else would have required a decision he preferred not to make. Whether keeping it was an act of memory or an act of possession or something else entirely, something that does not have a clean name in any language. What the record can tell us is this. A 23-year-old corporal from Brooklyn walked a German officer up a flight of cellar stairs on April 18, 1945, 12 days before the end of the war in Europe, and he did not say a word of triumph. He marked the time in his field notebook. He wrote that the man walked out and did not look back, and then he went home and taught mathematics for 31 years and kept the proof of what had happened in a shoebox where nobody would find it until after he was gone. He had spent 31 years telling students that every answer is either provable or it isn't. That if you cannot prove it, you do not know it yet. That the record is what makes knowledge different from opinion. That precision is not pedantry, it is respect. Respect for the truth of what actually happened as opposed to the more convenient version of what happened, which is always available, and always easier, and always in the end, less true. He kept Brandt's identification booklet. He kept his field notebook. He kept his silver star. He kept all three things in the same shoebox, and he kept that shoebox on the top shelf of his closet for 56 years, and he never displayed any of them, and he never explained any of them, and when he died, the explanation died with him. But the record was correct, and the record was findable, and when someone finally looked, everything was there. That is the only kind of victory the truth ever gets. Not a monument, not a ceremony, not a formal acknowledgement from the institution that almost erased it. Just the stubborn fact of its continued existence in a shoebox in an archive, in a supplemental folder, that somebody thought to cross-reference 60 years after the war. David Levine was a mathematics teacher from Brooklyn who fought in 3 countries and kept the evidence of 1 hour and 35 minutes in a Bavarian cellar for the rest of his life without ever explaining why. And because he kept it, and because Whitfield wrote it down, and because Strauss filed her report, and Morrow drove to Brooklyn and Webb read the cross-reference, and Summer had been waiting. The record of what happened on April 18, 1945 is now complete. Not complete in the sense of explained, complete in the sense of true, which is the only kind of complete that matters.